In the first half of the 20th century, even the somewhat more densely populated western part of Russia had many towns and cities that either had no direct road connections between them, or tenuous ones at best. And that was before you got into the various villages and industries that weren't based in major conurbations. What was present, though, was an extremely large number of lakes, rivers, and more recently, canals. Thus, an awful lot of cargo movement, communication, and law enforcement occurred via boat. During World War I and the subsequent Russian Civil War, the use of existing and improvised fleets of river monitors and small gunboats had been widespread and fairly successful. Thus, once the USSR had settled down to only having a few major purges every decade, a series of designs were drawn up to supplement or replace whatever was left, with a new series of armoured gunboats that could be mass manufactured, since if there was going to be a war, offensive or defensive, there would be an awful lot of waterways that would require covering. The essentials of gunboat design for this role, at whatever size, were a little bit more advanced than the typical gunboat that you might find elsewhere. Due to the need to potentially build many of them, they needed to be relatively small. This would also allow them to be moved between river and canal systems by rail, which further imposed limits on their beam and their overall weight. Since they would be the primary mobile force along the waterways, they'd also need to double up as troop transports and landing craft, which meant they would need a very shallow draft, as well as sufficient deck space to carry troops and supplies. And of course, since they'd likely end up in close-range firefights with tanks, field artillery, and infantry, they needed to be armoured, both generally along their sides and in particular, the main armament would need protection, since it would be the primary threat to enemy troops and the single most visible part of the craft, and thus likely to attract the most fire. One of the designs adopted for use was Project 1124, which was one of the larger types that was devised. Work started on the design in the early 1930s, with the first batch being ordered in 1935 and laid down in 1936. In its original form, the boat displaced 37 tons standard, with another 4 tons if it was fully loaded. Draft was a mere 75 centimetres, which meant it could float in water where a, admittedly somewhat uncomfortable, infantryman could actually walk alongside, with power provided by a pair of GAM-34 petrol engines, which gave a total of 1,350 shaft horsepower, supplied to 2 screws, for a sustained top speed of just under 18 knots, with another 3 to 4 knots on tap for short periods. The sides were protected by a 6mm armour belt with a 4mm deck. Now, granted this wasn't much, but it would stop lightweight small arms fire and splinters, or rifle and machine gun bullets at a distance if you were lucky. Armament consisted of a pair of 75mm or 3-inch guns in tank turrets, in this case taken from T-28 and T-35 series tanks, one mounted fore and one aft, along with a single machine gun that was mounted on the roof of the bridge. As World War II broke out, more craft were ordered. The second batch, built in 1940, used the GAM-34BS engine, which gave a total of 1,700 shaft horsepower for a pair, although top speed actually fell slightly as more fuel had been added to increase range, along with 7 additional crew for a total of 20, and there was an upgrade from one machine gun to a twin shielded mount. There was also a flared bow and another millimetre of armour installed on the side. The 2 turrets were also upgraded to naval models of the T-28 turret, which had significantly better elevation. After the Nazi invasion of the USSR, 3 further waves of construction were ordered in 1941, 42 and 43. The needs of war led to some simplification as well as some improvements. The improvements were that the main turrets were replaced with those from T-34 tanks. Initially, these were welded ones that the Red Army didn't especially like and were looking to get rid of, but later standard cast turrets fresh off the production line were installed as supply issues were resolved. These turrets were somewhat better protected than the older ones, which meant that range dropped as the turrets were heavier, even though more fuel had been added again. Initial shortages of tank turrets in the early part of the Russian involvement in World War II as well as later improvisation by the crews, also led to a number of alternate main armament fits, including a brief run with unshielded 3-inch guns, which was rather unpopular, but more commonly cited variants would have only a single tank turret up front, with the rear turret replaced by something else. This could be another twin machine gun mount, a 37mm anti-aircraft gun, or a set of rails for artillery rockets, either 12 rails or 8, depending on the size of the rockets in question. A few even sported 1 or 2 82mm mortars in this area. Some were also cited with an additional twin machine gun mount which was installed ahead of and beneath the forward tank turret, which technically made that turret super firing. Engines used in these production periods varied wildly, pretty much depending on what was available. The intended engines could occasionally be found to have been replaced with safe flight life expired aircraft engines, since if one of them broke down on the water, it wasn't going to just fall out the sky, it wasn't there in the first place. Lend-Lease Packard engines could also be found in some of them, or really just about any engine capable of between 800 and 1,000 horsepower or so that could be found and would run reasonably well was slapped in where needed. Or in extremis, a relatively unreliable engine could be stuffed in there, providing it was easy to fix. Lots of minor features were also removed or changed. For example, crew furniture, galvanization of the steel plating, and lino deck covers were all replaced with simple painted surfaces. Aluminium gratings were replaced with those made of wood or steel. Copper tubes were replaced with steel versions, and the various pumps were switched from electrically powered units to manually operated units, and in some boats, even the searchlights were removed. As well as saving rare war materials and simplifying production, the cumulative weight savings were mostly expended in upgrading the side armour over the fuel tanks to 14mm thick, which at least meant you weren't about to explode or be set dramatically on fire from a lucky rifle shot. Known in service as BK or Bronakata boats, which means armoured ship, the BK-1124 series was heavily involved throughout the war, being used on and even ahead of the front lines as they took landing parties via the waterways behind German lines to attack critical targets, as well as finding their way into some of the more forgiving areas of the Baltic with mixed success. Quite a few, unsurprisingly, would be lost to enemy fire and mines, but a large portion of the well over 100 built survived, with some still being preserved as war memorials to this day. There was a more advanced version using a T-34-85 set of turrets, which also uniformly increased the thickness of the armour belt, but this was only a prototype built at the end of the war and didn't enter mass production.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.